Hey there, folks. If you want to stay up to date with the latest news and analysis, make sure you follow S News to catch this and future videos. And if you like what you see, please support us by subscribing, liking, and dropping a comment. It really helps us out. Europe has finally had enough of China's deception. The EU is taking tough action.
Europe has finally had enough of China's deception. The EU is taking tough action.
Russia and China, China and Russia, both led by their respective leaders, have forged a dangerous and deadly alliance.
According to the head of the CIA, the United States is confident China is considering supplying Russia with lethal weapons. Evidence also shows a booming new trade relationship between the two. Beijing and Moscow have reaffirmed their no-limits partnership, built on strong strategic and economic ties. The big question now is, can this alliance challenge Western dominance?
After years of watching China secretly funnel technology and financial lifelines to Russia, the EU has finally decided to act. In a sweeping move, part retaliation, part warning, Brussels has imposed sanctions on several Chinese banks and companies. The message is clear. China's quiet support for Russia in the Ukraine war will not go unnoticed.
China, of course, is protesting. But even top Chinese officials have admitted they can't afford to let Russia lose the war. Today, we look at how China's hidden support for Russia has exposed its false image of neutrality, from secret bank transactions to drone parts stamped "Made in China."
To understand why the EU has taken such a hard line, we need to go back to the roots of the Russia-China partnership. It actually began before the Ukraine war even started. Just weeks before Russia's 2022 invasion, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a no-limits partnership agreement in Beijing, pledging boundless friendship and, no forbidden areas of cooperation. It was more than just words. It was a clear signal to the world that the two were ready to stand together against Western pressure. Their relationship only deepened after Western sanctions hit Russia hard. When those sanctions cut Moscow off from the SWIFT global banking system, many expected Russia's economy to collapse quickly.
It didn't, largely because China stepped in. Trade between the two nations soared after 2022. In 2023 alone, bilateral trade hit $240 billion, up 26% from the year before, and has since broken that record. China became Russia's top trading partner, supplying everything from consumer goods to industrial equipment, while buying Russian oil and gas at a discount. China maintained the image of a neutral player, even releasing a vague 12-point peace plan in early 2023 that called for a ceasefire and respect for sovereignty. But, notably avoided condemning Russia's actions.
European leaders saw it as a diplomatic smokescreen. Meanwhile, evidence piled up that China was quietly supplying Russia with dual-use items like semiconductors, electronics, and drone parts. Chinese engines disguised as refrigeration units ended up powering Russian drones in Ukraine. Explosives were shipped disguised as chemicals. This covert assistance has helped Russia launch hundreds of drone attacks on Ukrainian cities each month, devastating civilian infrastructure. By 2024, reports showed over half of Russia's battlefield electronics came from Chinese suppliers, either directly or via intermediaries. For Europe, this proved that China was enabling Russia's war effort, not pushing for peace.
In July 2025, the EU rolled out its 18th package of sanctions related to Russia's war, but this time they also targeted Chinese entities. Two small regional banks near the China-Russia border were blacklisted for helping Russian firms bypass sanctions. 5 Chinese tech companies supplying electronics and semiconductors to Russia's weapons systems were also hit.
The EU accused these companies of violating strict export controls banning the sale of dual-use goods to Russia. It was a major shift. Europe was no longer just punishing Russia, but also those enabling it.
This move wasn't just economic, it was deeply political. Brussels wanted to send a warning. If you help Russia, you're part of the problem. But the risk is huge. China is the EU's second largest trading partner, with bilateral trade worth over 800 billion euros in 2024. The sanctions came just days before a high-level EU-China summit, a deliberate signal that polite warnings were over. The United States quietly backed the move, sharing intelligence with Brussels and imposing its own sanctions on Chinese companies aiding Russia. China's response was swift. It accused the EU of overreach, claimed the sanctions violated WTO rules, and began looking for ways to hit back.
One of its first moves was launching an investigation into European brandy, hurting French exporters by about 50 million euros a month. Beijing also has far more powerful options, like restricting exports of rare earth minerals vital for Europe's clean energy and EV industries, or cutting pharmaceutical supplies.
Luxury goods and the automotive sector are also vulnerable. Chinese consumers spend billions each year on European brands, and China is a key market for car makers like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes. Any retaliatory tariffs could cost them hundreds of millions. Airbus could also be in trouble. China buys about 1 in every 5 planes they make. A $17 billion order for 140 planes could be delayed or scaled back if tensions rise. Europe knows it can't completely cut ties with China. The economic relationship is just too deep. Instead, the EU is trying to de-risk, reducing dependence on China without a full break. This means diversifying supply chains, shifting production to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico, and boosting domestic manufacturing.
The bottom line, Europe is making a calculated move, sending a strong message to China while trying to shield its own economy. But both sides have leverage, and neither looks ready to back down.
What began as a dispute over the Ukraine war is quickly becoming a broader power struggle over trade, influence, and the shape of the global order. It's a long story, but the shift won't be quick or easy. China still offers cheap labor, massive factories, and a huge consumer base. But Europe is now thinking more long-term. Leaders are talking more about economic security and resilience, making sure Europe can withstand rising global tensions. That's why we're seeing new trade deals, bigger investments in local industries, and efforts to build stronger ties with countries that share Europe's values. While the EU pushes back against China's support for Russia, it's also walking a fine line, defending its principles without damaging its economy. The strategy isn't to isolate China completely, but to be smarter, safer, and better prepared for what's ahead.
All this is creating a world split into new blocks. On one side, the West is tightening coordination on sanctions and trade restrictions. For them, it's not just about business or sanctions, but about power. On the other, China and Russia are building a parallel system that doesn't rely on Western tech or finance. Their trade is expected to hit $300 billion in 2025, and they're using their own currencies for 90% of transactions, bypassing the US dollar. That matters, because dollar dominance gives the West leverage to enforce sanctions. If Beijing and Moscow can create a real alternative, that leverage weakens. This divide raises a big question. Is trade becoming a permanent weapon? The EU's sanctions on Chinese banks and companies are part of what some call weaponized interdependence, where economic ties are used for punishment or control. And right now, it's hard to argue that isn't happening.
But in this divided world, countries like India, connected to both East and West, are being pulled in both directions. India has boosted trade with China to $136 billion in 2024, but also relies heavily on Western investment and technology. It buys cheap Russian oil, about 1.8 million barrels a day in 2024, up from 2 million before the war, all while keeping ties with the EU. Recently, this has become a political flashpoint, with former US President Donald Trump threatening tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil. Senator Lindsey Graham went even further, warning that the US would hit you hard and crush your economy. India's response has been clear. It will do whatever is necessary for its people, since energy security is its top priority. These are ripples in the water, but bigger rifts, like the EU-China split, could force India to choose a side, something it's avoided so far.
Turkey is another wild card. It's a NATO member but has kept trade flowing with both Russia and China. In 2024, Turkish exports to Russia hit $7 billion, including machinery often used for military purposes. At the same time, Turkey has strengthened ties with China through a range of deals. Ankara is playing both sides, but EU sanctions on Chinese companies are pressuring Turkey to tighten its export controls. If it doesn't, it risks EU tariffs. A big deal, since 40% of Turkey's exports, worth about $90 billion in 2024, go to Europe. But siding with the EU could hurt its growing partnership with China, which is a major investor in Turkish infrastructure. African nations are also caught in the middle. Many depend on Chinese loans and infrastructure. Beijing invested $30 billion in Africa in 2024 for roads and ports. But Europe is a major aid donor, providing $20 billion a year to sub-Saharan Africa. Countries like Nigeria and Kenya don't want to alienate either side. For example, Nigeria sells $2 billion worth of oil to Europe, but also signed a $5 billion deal with China to build a new port in 2025. If EU-China tensions escalate, these nations may have to choose between Chinese investment and European aid, a decision that could reshape their economies.
This battle for influence is creating a world where trust is eroding fast. EU sanctions are making countries rethink their alliances, and the ripple effects could last for decades. Energy markets are another flashpoint in this big geopolitical equation.
Well, thanks for sticking with us and listening to the whole story. If you want to keep up with these global shifts, don't forget to follow